The objectives of the assignment are really mainly to create photographic images that communicate meaning beyond its literal subject matter, to continue to strengthen skills in vision and composing images using the principles and elements of design, seeing dynamically. That's really a lot about what we've been talking about for this past assignment. Also continue to strengthen your skills in camera operation with correct exposure, everything being sharply focused, etc. Continue to strengthen your skills in digital image and camera raw adjustments as well. I want to show you some images, and I'm going to start with this image by Robert Hirsch. And Robert Hirsch is an author. This is actually the cover of one of his books. He talks a lot about this idea of making imagery. And in this case, his book is called Transformational Image Making, Handmade Photography since 1960. And here's a quote where he says, "What's important is how you visualize what you're seeing and thinking in your head, and how you make that vision materialize on paper or on a screen." So it's really about this idea of how you make that vision materialize, how you make it rather than just taking a picture. And this is a great image. This is a great example of that. It's a nighttime shot where he's making a long exposure, and then someone is drawing carefully the outline of this figure into the photograph, which segues nicely into Ansel Adams, who said, "You don't take a photograph, you make it." And what he meant by that was, there's a lot that goes into understanding how to put things together to create something that has very strong visual value. So Ansel Adams spent most of his life visiting and revisiting many locations that he wanted to photograph. He would watch the same places with variations of light and variations of weather through time, and he would select the best options for how he wanted to portray the scenes. But it didn't come easily, and he would travel around in this old Woody with his 8x10 view camera. You can see him standing up on top of it. And he would photograph scenes many times, sometimes hundreds of times, before he really got the scene that he wanted. Here's an image that he created of Yosemite Valley in 1935. And you can bet that when if you walked to the scene and you just took a picture just by aiming your camera into the scene and capturing it, you wouldn't be able to reproduce it, or you wouldn't be able to reveal a lot of the things that he was able to reveal through the process that he understood so well. So this idea of making rather than taking is very important. So I want to talk about symbolic meaning, because really that's what this assignment is about too. Symbolic meaning is about the content of the photograph and the message that it conveys. A symbol is something that stands for, represents, or points to something else besides the thing itself. In this case, it's the American flag, the red, white, and blue American flag. So symbolism holds a vast power for image makers because it allows the communication of complicated ideas. So here's Robert Mapplethorpe in 1977, and this is, kind of right after Vietnam War. There's a lot of unrest in our country, and this flag is meant to symbolize that unrest. It's a tattered American flag, and it's a silhouette of a flag with the sun shining behind it, so it becomes desaturated. It becomes like a black flag. So this is very symbolic. Here's an image, a more contemporary image made this past year by Cornwagon Thunder, which is kind of an unusual name. Let me read a little bit. This is information from the assignment itself, which is on Canvas, but I'll read through it first, and then I'll talk a little bit about Cornwagon Thunder. So often the concepts of emotion, mood, or of a certain thought are expressed in the techniques of symbolism. For example, justice, freedom, charity, or other emotional ideas can be represented in a way that communicates to the viewer their intended meaning. Symbols such as a balance of weights, an eagle, or an open hand, or in this case a frying pan, can depict these concepts respectively. Frequently, figures possess elements of what they refer to in a more literal way. An example of this would be the use of an apple to represent temptation, as in the story of Adam and Eve. or the insertion of a hammer and a sickle to represent the industrial worker and the peasant, the two symbols for Soviet Russia. So here in this image, we have this woman holding a skillet in front of her face, almost as if it's a makeup mirror or something. So she's leaning casually against a backdrop, illuminated with a warm glow. She's obviously alive, but it's kind of interesting that she places this pan in front of her face. So this artist, Cornwagon Thunder, who created this image, says of her, she says it's an investigation into the aging process that a woman goes through. And so she calls it rebirth of agency. She also says physically it's a reference to the battle axe, a pejorative term for an old woman who are sometimes portrayed as angry, always chasing their husbands around, fussing at them. As I'm entering into perimenopause myself and dealing with the physical process and emotional impacts that has on one person, I'm using that photograph to talk a little bit about the grieving process of losing the ability to reproduce, but also as a way to reclaim one's agency. Thus, she calls it rebirth of agency. So, a very interesting way to use symbolism here. Here's another one of her images called Infidelity. I Walk with Impunity. So this is from a series called To Be and Become, which investigates her approach to becoming a woman. So Cornwagon's Thunder says this about her image. This is from a series called To Be and Become, which investigates my approach to becoming a woman and looking back at my mother's era. In this photograph, I'm looking at thistles as a symbol of fidelity and thinking about the notion of being bound in a relationship or in a marriage contract. This sort of moral code of monogamy that's placed on us by society. I was thinking about the piousness of those who are able to maintain their loyalty, how that relates to religious mores, and questioning the wrongness and the rightness of that, or how that might affect women differently than men. I think in a relationship in general, you have a blind faith and you accept it. To question that relationship isn't necessarily condoned, especially in my upbringing. Once you're locked into a marriage, it's understood that you don't stray, or if you do, it's not talked about. I'm looking at the damsel in distress, tied up at the railroad track, and playing with the same tension around being tied up. Here's a very interesting symbolic image by Andy Freeberg from a series called Guardians, made in 2009. Not only does symbolism include and then this is text from the assignment. Not only does symbolism include particular shapes, objects, or discernible figures to represent a meaning, but the position and stance of a work can also shed light on a nuance of the piece's intended purpose. The way in which a figure in the photograph is standing, sitting, postured, or leaning could also express certain concepts that the artist is wishing to communicate. The materials chosen or the manner in which something is created also gives meaning and possible symbolism to a piece. So in this case, he's creating a whole series of images of these women, these Soviet women who are actually museum docents. They're there to sit in the museum so people don't touch the artwork. But he's photographing them next to these pieces of art, and then they become these really interesting kinds of, kind of comparison between this woman and these women in this painting here. Here's another one of this woman standing in front of a painting. And here's a third by Andy Freeberg from the same series of Guardians, with these, a different place within the museum, I guess. But they're all very symbolic and very interesting in the way that we're comparing their bodies and who they are with the artwork that's here. And the photographer is very careful about the way that things are framed, and in the context of many, like all three of these images, we're seeing some really interesting relationships and creating a really strong context. But certainly you can see that her posture is reflective of their posture, and I think that's really wonderful. So be sure to draw and grow from the principles and elements of design that we've been learning about and using in this last assignment, Dynamic Vision. Think about colors, lines, shapes, patterns, textures, space, balance, contrast, focus. There's a lot of things you can really talk about that we've been really thinking about, and how we use the camera to create interesting things. So here's some interesting shadows. This artist, Giacomo Brunelli, is making some kind of, he's abstracting the figure by the way that he frames it in the space. And I think he's really using positive and negative space in a beautiful way, using texture well. And then also it becomes part of a series. This is only two. There's actually more here, but in the context of many, it becomes really interesting. So, and two, I know for this assignment you're going to have to title your work. It's interesting. He writes untitled, and he just calls this shadow number 7. This is shadow number 3. And they're really from the series where everyone is an untitled piece, but it's just numbered. But that's kind of interesting too. Here's Nick Knight, who is a fashion photographer. He's very prolific. You've probably seen a lot of his work because he's been in most of the major magazines for fashion industry. But Nick Knight has also put pressure on the fashion industry to be held accountable to the massive issues of social inequality it had previously hosted without resistance. So it's kind of like a new way of thinking about fashion, and he's influenced a lot of people to think about who fashion is accessible to and the kinds of people that are being photographed and the way that he's portraying them. So it's kind of, he really abstracts the subjects quite a bit, but it really gets you thinking about fashion. Here she's got paint all over her. I think that's really interesting. Most of his models are, they're just quite unusual, and they aren't the conventional kind of model that you're probably thinking should be in the picture. It's a really different kind of application, or there's a different kind of sensibility that he's using with the models. And in the context of many, his images are just quite interesting. Also, I would say he's really thinking about color, this like purple and yellow, these colors that can be complementary, like greenish yellow and purple, and then he's got this blue smoke. The way he uses light is probably coming from behind the smoke here. He's very aware of using the tools of photography to achieve this. Use formal qualities of the images to draw viewers into aesthetic experiences, while using figures, objects, and settings to suggest narratives that have potential to gain symbolic meaning. Examples of this could be clothing that could impersonate a lifeless being, a shadow encroaching signifies a darkness or danger, a mirror might reflect a character's other entity, maybe there's a dual personality or something. If you use doors or doorways, they might represent portals in or out, or this idea that here's, like an opportunity. Unrealistic colors evoke imaginary worlds within states of mind or characters. So here's Robert Frank. This is a Robert Frank image. Robert Frank was photographing in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And here he's highlighting the division of black and white Americans during the civil rights era. This piece is called Trolley, New Orleans, and it's a fleeting moment that conveys this brutal social order of post-war America. The picture, incidentally, was shot a few weeks before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and the image was unplanned. But the amazing thing about it, I think, is how there's these divisions, like he's got black Americans and white Americans in different little windows here, little compartments, and I think that in itself is very symbolic of this same idea. And the last image I'll show you here is Ai Weiwei, famous artist, contemporary artist, but in 1995 he became famous for this image. What he did was he took this famous Han Dynasty urn and he photographed himself dropping it and smashing it on the ground, which was very symbolic of looking at a culture that he wanted to break down and he wanted to change his own culture. So this idea of breaking the pot became symbolic of that. Yeah, so this assignment, let's see, I think that's the last slide. Yes, it is. So we'll talk more about this in class, but hopefully this gives you a few ideas about how to begin thinking about this assignment.